The Bretons broke and ran down Senlac Hill, and this time no Saxon chased them. On the morning of 14 of October 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, had thrown his whole army against a wall of English shields on a ridge in Sussex, and on his left flank, the assault had already crumbled. For decades, historians would argue over how close this battle truly was. But the single decision that shaped everything came not from the Duke, but from the English king, who stood in his own front line and gave one order: hold. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The men Harold Godwinson commanded were not a mob of peasants. At the center stood his housecarls, professional soldiers sworn to the crown, axes over their shoulders, packed shoulder to shoulder behind their painted shields. Around and behind them stood the fyrd, the levied freemen of the shires. Harold had crowned himself only 9 months before, on 6th of January, the day after Edward the Confessor died childless and left the succession in dispute. He had already destroyed one invader. Now he faced another, and when the Breton wing fled and the temptation came to break formation and pursue, the housecarls did not move. The line stayed whole. The Norman attack, having spent itself against unbroken shields, began to lose its shape on the slope below. Somewhere in the press, a cry went up that the Duke was dead. In the real Battle of Hastings, William had heard that same rumor, torn off his helmet, and ridden along his lines so his men could see his face, and the panic died. This time, no one corrected it. The Bretons were already streaming back across the marshy ground at the foot of the ridge, and the rumor ran with them like fire through dry reeds. The cavalry that had been the terror of the English shield wall, the mounted knights the Saxons could not answer, began to recoil. What had been an ordered withdrawal became a general flight. William was somewhere in that chaos, and the soft ground below the ridge did the rest. Horses foundered. The Duke was pulled down. We should not romanticize how a man dies in the mud of a losing field. The sources that survive in this timeline are thin and contradictory, and heroic detail is exactly what such moments do not leave behind. What matters is the outcome. The papal banner that Rome had blessed for this campaign went down with him. The combined arms army that had crossed the Channel, infantry, archers, and knights together, a force the English could not match, had lost the mind that directed it. By dusk, the invasion had no commander, and the Anglo-Saxon monarchy, which in our history ended on this ridge, was still standing. The survivors did not wait for morning to think it over. Odo of Bayeux, William's half-brother and bishop, and Eustace of Boulogne, one of the great magnates of the expedition, gathered what men they could and turned for the coast. The fleet still lay where it had beached near Pevensey since 28th of September. There was nothing left to fight for. Their claimant was dead, their banner lost, and the country around them belonged to a king who had just beaten them in the field. So they sailed. They left their dead unburied on the slope and carried home the news that the great gamble had failed. Harold did not have to fight a second battle. He reoccupied the south of England without another clash, moving through a countryside that had been braced for conquest and was now simply his again. It is worth pausing on how strange this outcome would have seemed to the men who lived it. The Norman enterprise had been years in the planning, backed by the Pope, manned by knights from across northern France. It ended not in a siege or a long war, but in a single afternoon and a scramble for the ships. Yet a defeated invasion is not the same as a golden age. Harold's England was intact and immediately faced the harder question of what to do with victory. Harold understood that the throne he had defended was still a contested one. He set about binding the realm rather than punishing it. Loyal thieves who had marched south with him were rewarded, but the more delicate work lay in the north, where the Earls Edwin and Morcar commanded the great blocks of Mercia and Northumbria. Their armies had been broken at Fulford on 20th September, before Harold's own victory over Harold Hardrada and Tostig at Stamford Bridge 5 days later. The northern earls were weakened, wary, and essential. Harold reconciled with them and reached toward a marriage tie to the northern house, knitting the family of the earls into the crown by blood. There remained Edgar the Aetheling, the last male of the old House of Wessex, a boy with the purest dynastic claim of anyone alive. In our history, his survival became a rallying point for revolts against Norman rule. Here, Harold made a quieter choice: keep him close, honored, watched, not crowned, not exiled, not killed. It left a question unresolved. A living atheling was a claim that could always be raised again, but raising it now would mean civil war among people who had just saved the kingdom together, and no one was willing to strike that match. The succession stayed disputed in principle and stable in fact. The Channel was quiet, but the North Sea was not. Sweyn Estrithson of Denmark had his own dynastic interest in England, and in our history he sent a fleet to the northern coast in 10,069 to exploit the wreckage of Norman rule and the risings against it. In this timeline, he tested the same waters, probing the Humber and the northern shires as raiders had done for generations. What he found was different. Instead of a fractured occupation and a hostile population ready to rise against foreign lords, he met a unified English defense under a king who had already destroyed 2 invasions in a single autumn. The mathematics of the raid did not favor him. There was no Norman garrison to overthrow and no English faction eager to trade one master for a Danish one. Edwin and Morcar, reconciled to Harold, held the north with the crown behind them rather than against it. Sweyn, a practical man, did what practical raiders did when conquest looked expensive and tribute looked cheap. He settled for silver and trade. England's ties to the Scandinavian world stayed what they had long been: commercial, dynastic, sometimes violent, but not the doorway to another conquest. And then came the change that would prove deepest of all, though no one at the time could have named it. In our history, the Norman victory placed a French-speaking aristocracy above the English within a generation. Land, law, and lordship passed into the hands of men who did not speak the language of the people they ruled, and over centuries that collision reshaped English itself into the tongue we speak now, thick with French and Latin words layered over its Old English core. None of that happened here. There was no imported aristocracy to rule from above in another language. The clerks who drafted charters, the lords who held the courts, the priests who kept the church's records, all continued in the Old English they had already been using, for England in 1066 was no primitive place. It was a centralized state with shires and sheriffs, a system of royal writs, and a written vernacular of law and administration. That machinery kept running in its own words. We should be careful here. No one can say with certainty what a language becomes over 500 unwritten years. But the great overwriting that produced modern English, the flood of Norman French into every register of speech, simply never began. The other Norman legacy was written on the land itself. In our history, the conquerors blanketed England with castles, first earth and timber mottes, then stone, and reorganized who held land and on what terms, importing a continental style of feudal tenure that bound men to lords in a strict pyramid of service. The countryside was garrisoned and remapped by foreign power. In this timeline, the mottes were never raised. The earls and thegns held their land on older English terms, inheritances and obligations that had grown up over generations rather than being imposed at sword point by a new elite. Royal authority still ran the way it always had, through the shire court, the sheriff and the writ, a king's command carried in his own language to his own officials. This was not a land without hierarchy or hardship. It was a land whose hierarchy remained continuous with its own past instead of being broken and rebuilt from the top. The difference is easy to overstate and worth stating carefully. England did not become free or equal. It remained itself, developing along the lines it had already drawn. England, in the end, kept looking the way it always had, north and east, toward the sea it knew. In our history, the Norman Conquest tied the English crown to Normandy, and then, through inheritance and marriage, dragged it into a sprawling cross-channel realm, an Angevin empire whose quarrels in France would shape English politics for centuries. Here that pull never came. The crown had no French province to hold, no continental inheritance to defend, no reason to spend English blood and silver on wars across the Channel. Instead, the kingdom stayed anchored in the Scandinavian and North Sea world it had belonged to since before Knut, its law and church and speech developing outward from Anglo-Saxon roots that, in our timeline, were overwritten within a lifetime. We cannot know what such an England would ultimately have become, and it would be a mistake to imagine it as a paradise lost or a triumph clean and simple. A duke died in the mud below a ridge, and because of it a language, a law, and a way of holding land continued where ours were transformed. History turned on a single order to hold the line. It is a reminder of how much can hinge on one decision, made in a moment, by men who could not see the centuries it would move.